Hi, welcome. This is Dr. John DeMartini. This is one of the most amazing and inspiring shows that you can listen into. If you want to be on the edge of your seats, if you want to open up your heart, if you want to expand your mind, and you want to meet incredible people, stay tuned because you're just about to experience a transformative radio show that will change your life. And you're listening to the Dr. Pat Show that's coming up right next.
Welcome to the Dr. Pat Show. Talk radio to thrive by. Powerful, inspiring, and coming to you live, bringing you stories of people like you and me, busting through and living life full out. Get ready to dare to wonder what your life would be like if you knew you could not fail. Hey everybody, welcome. It's so great to have all of you tune us in and turn us on. I got like a big little laughing thing I got going on here for a minute. Happy day to all of you. It's a great day. You know, what I love is we're going to do a couple of things today differently. And the first thing we're going to do out of the gate differently is that we actually have a very special guest who has two different books, but they're like so interweaved in their message. And today it's going to be exciting to really chat with him. Many of you have heard me talk about my family and my stepmom side, all growing up in the Deep South. So you've always heard me say Deep South, right? And then you would hear me talk about like, you know, grandma who used to be down there with her potbelly stove and the outhouse. I mean, seriously, my dad like got electric and everything put in her house. But one of the things you've also heard me talk about is what happens when traditions are passed down and these traditions don't quite make it to what might be in our pop culture. But for people like grandma, grandpa down there on the farm, they were healing. Today, Brandon Weston, healer, writer, folklorist, owns and operates Ozark Healing Traditions. It's an online collective of articles, lectures, workshops, anything related to the Ozark Mountain region. Now, if you don't know what that is, you're going to hear from him today. But this is where, when you all hear me talk about the fact, and I've said this a couple of times, have you ever wondered how, as a civilization, like humans, how we actually made it this far? And so you've heard me talk about the fact that up until contemporary pharmaceuticals, I don't know what else to call them, we had to count on nature. And I wish I could say that there was a great science to it, because if you ever watch my grandma and my grandpa, like grandma would just like conjure something up, and you know, you happen to be the guinea pig, because if it was something she never conjured up before, you got to experience whether it's going to work or not. Now she never lost anybody, so I'm just going to say that grandma didn't kill anybody. But there were traditions that when you were that close to the land that you learned. Has anybody ever wondered, am I like Brandon and I probably wondered, how did we make it this far? Like, okay, so how did we make it to the point where we were able to heal ourselves without going to the drugstore? How did we do that? That's what today's show is about. But it's from a part of the country we don't talk about enough. That's why I've got Brandon joining me here today. And by the way, look, two books. We're going to take them one at a time. I'm not sure which order I have them in, but we're going to talk about two. One is, oh, I so love this word, Ozark Folk Magic. Now, we're going to be able to talk stories on this. What a great book he has put together. And he's got the Granny Woman in here. So we're like, I'm looking at Granny Woman. I'm like, did he know my grandma? I'm just thinking to myself. And then the other one is this Ozark Martin spell book. And what it means is, look, see my background? See that? That would be the way my grandma's kitchen looked, just saying. But see, we're going to talk about this, but it's all in the spirit of healing. Brandon, great to have you. Thank you for joining me here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
I think you put my grandma in your books, just saying.
I probably did. Yeah.
I was reading it. Look, now, very I have a very interesting family history. I'm a girl that was raised in the Bronx who had a dad that married a very young woman, 30 years to his youth, who was raised like down there in the deepest, right, the potbelly stove to cook and the outhouse. But let's talk about your relationship and heritage to this and what it is that we need to preserve about this knowledge. Because if we don't preserve this, we're going to be out of luck in so many ways. But how about you? What got you tapped into this part of the country? And tell everybody what part of the country we're talking about, please.
Yeah, so we're talking about the Ozark Mountain region. It's one of those areas that, always gets placed in the Midwest, but it's not quite the Midwest. It kind of isn't quite the Great Plains, Kansas region. It's not quite the Delta. It's not quite the Deep South. It just sort of hangs in between all of these places. And it's considered, it's a mountain range, although the mountains that we have aren't geographically true mountains. It's a worn down plateau, ancient plateau that was worn down by rivers. So we don't have true mountains like the Rockies, things like that, but we still like to call them our Ozark Mountains. So really the region is defined geographically in this way. If you look all around the Ozarks, up into Missouri, down into South Arkansas, over towards the Delta, it's flatland, it's riverland, it's Great Plains, swampland down towards the Deep South and Louisiana. And so the mountains just sort of rise up out of nowhere. And, it's kind of a nice sight, especially if you're coming across flat Oklahoma or Kansas, to see the mountains in the distance just sort of pop up. And because of this sort of geographical weirdness, Ozark people, when they came around the turn of the 19th century, about 1810, they came to the land after the forced removal of the Osage to Oklahoma. And they came from Appalachia. And they came to the Ozarks because the Ozarks were so familiar to them. And so if anybody has been to both Appalachia and the Ozarks, you will know that. The flora, the fauna, the landscape is so similar. So the Ozarks were actually still considered a part of the greater Appalachian cultural region, which means that our traditions, although they have evolved in isolation in the Ozarks over the past 200 years, a lot of our traditions can still be traced back to Appalachian families. Mm-hmm. And of course, Appalachian families being mixed European and New World as well. So it's really an amalgam tradition. And for me, I grew up an Ozarker. I'm a multi-generational Ozarker. I grew up here on the land. I grew up with family traditions that, I never really thought about. I always wondered why, some of my friends didn't, believe in the same things that I did, or didn't have home remedies and things like that. But I never really thought anything of it until I got to college. And I encountered one of the big Ozark folklorists of the first part of the 20th century, Vance Randolph, and his Ozark Magic and Folklore, which is still in print. I started reading it, and it was like he had interviewed my family.
Yeah.
Everything he was talking about. So that really got me interested in where I situated myself in the Ozarks, where my family was situated. And then I really got interested in, well, are these practices still around? Are these traditions around? Have they been lost? A lot of time has passed between the folklorists that were writing about the Ozarks and now. Ozark Magic and Folklore was published in 1947. A lot has happened since, 1930s, 1940s. So that has been the biggest part of my personal mission is, bringing the Ozarks, specifically healing and magical traditions, into the 21st century, updating the story that unfortunately people haven't really, cared about, I guess, for quite a while.
And what's interesting about this is that I want to say congratulations on your newest book, newest book. I mean, you just you've got it all going on. I can't wait to even your next book. I don't even know what that's going to be about. But this one is about the Mountain Spell book. And the reason I'm so interested in this is my folks, if you just scooch over, like if you're on the map, there you are right there in the middle. And if you just scooch over, there's the Clark and the Glover family over there hanging out. But the reason I'm familiar with the Ozark, I wonder if I'm allowed to admit this on air. The reason I'm so familiar with it is Grandma and Grandpa used to like run the moonshine back and forth between where they were, right? And they had the scariest time of my life, just saying, was discovering the still and watching that thing overheat because my uncle was not watching it. Okay, if you ever watch like old school, right, making the moonshine stuff. But the reason that was so familiar is, my family had this interesting connection. Now, we're not from there, but I will tell you, I am 99.9% sure of what Grandma was doing with herbs and healing and rituals she got from her moonshine buddies, like over that way. I say over that way. I want to ask you this question because I really do believe that if we don't remember why we are even here as humans, see, it's so easy to forget that we are rugged and we are innovative. And if you are in Ozark territory, as Grandma used to say, what she used to call, she had a name. I can't remember what the name was. Really, just imagine the Southern drawl and talking about the folk. She'd call them the folk. But here's what I want to ask you. They're in the middle of what some people would say, my Canadian friend would say, this is the way they talk about their country, in the middle of nowhere. They're not close to the port, right? They're not like at the ocean with the boats and stuff. But when you are in that situation, you have to be innovative and creative. Can you talk to the fact, and you mentioned it here, but because of that location and because people were drawn there, didn't they have to go an extra mile just to survive, Brandon?
Absolutely. Some of the defining characteristics of Ozark folk magic and medicine traditions is that everything had to be gathered from the land, grown on the land, or repurposed from inside the household.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, you had small families or clans that would settle on, down in a holler or up on a mountaintop or something like that. And they may not have another family nearby. It may take a couple hours to get to the closest family and that's on a mule. So you really, these practices developed in isolation in the Ozark region, but they really developed in isolation based on families. So really, when we look at a lot of the practices, we can't say that, this practice is what everybody in the Ozarks did, because it's not the case. Practices are based in families. So I always like to say there are as many practices as there are practitioners. And so that gives us a lot to work from, though, because everybody was constantly taking these practices and evolving them. And really, the evolving practice was because you had to survive. Yeah. So if something didn't work, you tried something else. If you couldn't find a certain plant that you needed because the winter was really bad and it didn't come up in the spring, then you had to be able to shift your focus and you had to know the other plants to use. Yeah. And so, Ozark people often, get the sort of stereotype of the simple hillbilly, that sort of thing. But these people were ingenious in a lot of their processes, and just the way that people have historically repurposed things symbolically. So when we start talking about magical traditions, repurposing brooms in the house, for instance, a broom can sweep up dirt in your house, but it can also sweep illness off of a person, or it can sweep evil out of the house. Yeah. Or knives and axes, these sort of blades that can magically cut hexes or curses off of people, things like that. And so back in Europe, in Britain specifically, the healers in southern Britain around Cornwall are sometimes called cunning folk. And, I really like that. It doesn't pop up in the Ozarks very much, but there is this understanding amongst Ozarkers that people with the gift or people with this power to heal are cunning people. And they are cunning people because they are able to figure out everything that needs to be done as a part of a ritual or just healing act. They're able to figure out all of the stuff that the rest of the community can't figure out. And so I always, when I do workshops and classes and things like that, I always tell people, from the outside, Ozark folk magic and healing isn't always a big show. Sometimes you don't even know a healer is healing because they don't have any outward rituals or outward forms. But the outward simplicity hides a very complicated understanding of the world and process underneath. Yeah. So I always tell people, we embrace simplicity in the Ozarks, but we are not simplistic people by any means.
Yeah. One of the things I was really struck by, and I just want to say, if you're just tuning in, Brandon is joining me here today, Brandon Weston. He's the author of the book that I have in front of me. The latest book is Ozark Mountain Spell Book. We're going to talk about that. And the other book is Ozark Folk Magic, which came out last year. But the point is, I have both of these together. I want to talk with you for a minute. I know you give a lot of credit to the indigenous people, as we all should. Hello, right? I mean, honestly, we came over, we brought disease over, and they healed us. I'm sorry, I simplified that. But there's something you say in here in this book, and I really want you to talk to it. You talk about the ever-growing spell book, and you really acknowledge the sophistication. This is my word. The sophistication of ritual. And somehow in the world, we made magic and spell dirty words. But yet they were so much part of what came forward. Why did you call this, in this part of the book, the ever-growing spell book? Because I know you must have been changed from writing this book. You must have discovered some stuff here. Now, I don't know if you want to give us your secrets, but it's like I knew you before you wrote the book, and then after you wrote the book, you're like, oh, I'm not done. Is that true?
It's absolutely true. I mean, like going back to just sort of the image of the Ozarker, traditionally, people have called us primitive, backwards, but they've also had this sort of, for a while, around the turn of the 20th century, there was this sort of understanding that hillfolk had this magic that no one really in town could understand. So people would send, patients and people that needed healing out to the mountains to go find a granny woman or find somebody who knew things or had the gift or had the power. And so there's been this sort of, the outer image doesn't always reflect the inner image. There's a famous Ozark saying that we always lie to strangers. And it's not out of any sort of malice or anything like that. It's a protection of the culture. Unless we get to know you, we don't reveal everything about ourselves as a way of protecting this work.
Yeah.
But to sort of talk about the ever-growing spell book, there's a notion within Ozark folk healing practices that everything is constantly in motion. Yeah. Everything is constantly changing. As one of my healers told me, if it works, it works. And this is kind of, people think this is a modern idea, with internet culture and all of this, we have exposure to a lot of different traditions, but people sort of keep older traditions on a museum shelf.
Yep.
And they don't understand that people have always worked dynamically. People have always brought in other practices. A healer might talk with a neighbor who knew some verbal charms or prayers, and they may say, well, why don't you pass me a few of those and I'll give you some things that I know. And that has always been the case.
Exactly.
So the ever-growing spell book for me is this idea that I am providing a sort of framework for people to work within the spell book. But I want people to take that and to evolve it. Yeah. I want people to take that and to talk with their families and incorporate in, prayers and charms and recipes from their own families. I want people, so part of the work that I do is I go back to ancestral traditions. So, for instance, one of my favorite plant groups to work with, which wasn't really worked with in the Ozarks, are the Artemisias. So mugwort and wormwood.
Yeah.
And those are cleansing plants. They are good for trance work, for if you want to, heal within sort of a soul trance spirit sort of thing. And it's just, they're good for all sorts of stuff. So these would have been plants valued by my German and Scandinavian ancestors. And so that's a part of my ever-growing spell book. I like bringing in these ancestral traditions. And so I always tell people, this work isn't formulaic. We have lots of formulas that we work within. Ozarkers are with magical timing and auspiciousness, but everything is done, as they say, in the spirit, which means connecting to your own source of inspiration and your own connection to the innate power of nature. So you may be working a ritual for somebody and you are led in the spirit to do something completely different than you were taught. And within the Ozark context, there's a place for this spirit leading. And it's actually a very important foundational piece of this work. So the ever-growing spell book is my way of encouraging people to be led by their own inspiration, be led by their own spirit in this work.
Yeah, I can't believe you brought up mugwort, because we're going to go through this book and we're going to talk about what we mean by magic theory, but we also need to talk about what we mean by Ozark magic theory, because there's a Southern folklore as well. And it's interesting. It depends on how far, when you say South, there's a South that's by the coast, but then there's the other South that's not by the coast, right? So we like to lump things together, but they're not. It's funny you brought mugwort up, because that really was, I believe it's indigenous to where my folks really kind of like, when you're looking at the West Virginia kind of deal over there, like over there in that part of the country, it's there. But we never knew what was on her table. Mm-hmm. And she would talk about it. She would show it to us. But, we were young kids. I do know one thing for sure. When we went and spent time with grandma and grandpa, we were never sick. Mm-hmm. When my sister got her head caught in a wasp nest and got bit close to death, grandma knew what to do. But my concern is that we can't lose this, and I'm like you. I know these rituals. I use what my grandma passed on to me on both sides. I have got another grandma from South America that I found out. Nobody admitted it. That was like another story. But we learn these things. I want to take a short break. When we come back, I want to talk about this folklore. I want to talk about the power of it. And I got to tell you, I love both of your books. I'm like, here's what I did. I was sending this back. I was like getting ready. I said, Linda, go get Kat at Llewellyn and tell them they gotta give Brandon publishing for cards, a deck of cards, because this is, for me, to have something like this that allows us to understand this. But boy, I'm reading this and I could remember my grandma getting nutmeg, the whole nutmeg, seriously. And whenever there was an event coming up, like with the harvest or like they grew stuff, she would get that nutmeg, right? And she would just nutmeg. We all had to grind the nutmeg up. And then what she would do is a ritual on the land with it. Why? When we come back, we're going to tell people, but let's tell people how they get a copy of this book and how they find out more about you. Because when we come back, I want to talk spells with you. How do we find out about you? There's so much on your website. I just love what you're doing, Brandon. I love it. So tell us about that.
I have a website, ozarkhealing.com. That's where I put most of my information, especially for classes, upcoming classes and events, that sort of thing. There's also recordings of virtual classes for purchase on the website.
Yes.
And that's the best way to get into contact with me too. I've got a contact page on there, but I also have a Facebook, Ozark Healing Traditions, an Instagram, at Ozark Healing Traditions, and a Twitter at Ozark Healing.
Can I ask you a question? I was looking at the upcoming, you have something April 23rd, divination and diagnosis in Ozark Folk Magic. That's coming up in April, is that correct?
Yeah, April 23rd.
But it's also a Zoom, right? You can do it on Zoom.
Right. It's a virtual class. And so all ticket holders will get a recording of the class afterwards.
Oh, yeah, I'm all over it.
So yeah, if you can't attend, you can still purchase a ticket, and then it will be in the store as a recording later on as well.
Okay, because this is really, I love that you're sharing. And then you've got something in May. The one I'm really interested in, I got to tell you, when we come back, I'm going to tell you the one I'm really interested in. I can't wait to do it. But why did she do this nutmeg? You know, like, what did she do with it and why'd she do it? When we come back, we're going to get some secrets from Brandon. Again, go to the website, lots of information. But here's what I want to say to all of you. How was it these traditions were passed on, especially between the Ozark region and what some people call Southern folk? But it's not the coastline Southern. It's like more in. So do you think maybe they swapped out moonshine for secrets? Let's take a short break, everybody. We'll be right back. Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm so thrilled to have you all meet Brandon. And by the way, I know this is one of the books we're talking about today, the spell book. However, I must say we're also talking about this. I'm weaving everything together. And the reason I weave them together is because if you look at this book, this is Ozark Folk Magic, Plants, Prayers, and Healings. This book here, I had on my desk for a while, and I pull this out because there's so much in here that Brandon has put in, everything about astrology, everything about the basics for Ozark Healings. But also there are things in here that if you think about the practices of things, then what starts to happen is you start to practice them. And when you start to practice them, it is good to get your practice tools from somebody like Brandon, who's like telling you this is the way it works. This is the healer in their work. This is what you do. This is Ozark doctoring, right? This is the way they go about it. This is how you gain power. And when you put the two books together, this is how we learn to be empowered in what comes from the earth and what comes from rituals passed on and what has been used by generation and generation of indigenous people. I'm just learning about that side of my family and the indigenous nature of that. Now, again, you can go to, I would just encourage everybody to go take a look at what Brandon's got going on. You can go over to his website, which is Ozark Healing. Did I get that right? OzarkHealing.com. Mm-hmm. Yep. And when you go over there, it's like I said, there are upcoming classes. The class that I looked at them all, but there's really kind of an interesting class that he's doing in June as well. And that's Ozark Astrology Magic. And I'm going to tell you why I'm so excited about that in a minute. But before I do, I got to ask you, what did Grandma know about that nutmeg? Because she knew something about that nutmeg, right?
So nutmeg is actually one of these crossovers between the Ozarks and Southern folk magic, yep. Specifically what we call Southern root work, conjure, hoodoo, which are traditions that are heavily influenced from Black communities, from yep. West African folk magic, as well as mixture of European and indigenous magic as well. Nutmeg in the Ozarks is usually used in its whole form as a good luck charm, almost yep. like a buckeye nut, yep. if you know the buckeye.
Totally.
So people would carry them around as sort of worry stones.
Rubbing stones. Grandpa did them as a rubbing. It's not a stone, but you know what I mean, a nut.
But the idea is that as you rub it, the good luck comes off. Yep. And I've seen it specifically with people that gamble a lot, things like that. They'll have these Buckeye nuts or they'll have the nutmeg. But even sort of greater than that, it has this connection to prosperity. And I have a theory that it goes back to availability of spices in, the 18th century, 16th, 17th century. The idea that, spices were things that rich people had. Poor people didn't have a lot of spices in their house. So nutmeg was one of those that, in the Ozarks, especially up until, pharmacies started coming around in these little towns, people didn't really have spices. They had to use plants that they could gather. And in the event that they got spices, they would treasure them, they would honor them. And so nutmeg is one of those that has this place of honor as a sort of connection to prosperity, connection to fortune, connection to good luck. And so from an Ozark context, I would say, the spreading the nutmeg on the fields or whatever is this idea of connecting to prosperity. We were so prosperous and fortunate this year, let us be just as fortunate next year.
And my grandma had crippling arthritis, and I've never seen anything like it. She could hardly walk, and the doctors couldn't do anything. The very fact that she was alive and could function was because of her knowledge, right? If you watched her daily ritual, I couldn't tell you what she put together. I couldn't tell you the tea she was drinking. I couldn't tell you the oil she made, right? But I will tell you that was the ritual that I think kept her alive as long as she did. This is what you're bringing to the forefront. I want to ask you this question. There's so much to talk about in both of the books, but I want to know, when you finished writing, there had to be a few surprises for you. There had to be a couple of things you found that you thought, what? I don't know that I knew that. What's on your top 3 list of the education of Brandon?
Well, I think the most surprising thing, number one for me, was just the fact that I had this gift in me as well. When I started the project that would eventually become Ozark Folk Magic, it looked completely different. I was coming at it from an academic folklorist standpoint. And as I was collecting information and things, I had an interview with an older lady who ended up being one of my principal teachers, who passed me a lot of things. And we were talking about something, and she would always get kind of annoyed with me and stop, and we'd have to change conversation because we would get into some heavy things. And so she just stopped me at one point and she said, "Why are you talking like you're not a part of this?"
Oh.
And it was just like something in my mind clicked. And after that, I started approaching things in a different way. I started collecting for my own practice, for my own personal development, spiritual development, magical development, whatever you want to call it. And so that was kind of the most surprising thing for me, was just, the realization that I am not just somebody on the outside looking in on a culture. I'm a part of this culture. I'm a part of this process. And so that the connection to these ancestral spirits, the connection to the land, all of this is sort of in me as well. But there have been other things too. I was, for a long time under the impression that, what the folklorists gave to us in the 30s and 40s was this snapshot of a culture that's still around today. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. Mm-hmm. But a surprise, this culture, a lot of the traditions we can see, we can call them dead traditions, whatever we want to call them, but they are alive and evolved. This isn't a museum, exhibit. This is a living culture. And it may look different from the past, but that's actually a good thing. It's good that these traditions evolve because we're constantly questioning the effectiveness of these traditions. And just like my Ozark ancestors, if it didn't work, you threw it out. And if something else worked, you brought it in and replaced it. So that was a surprise for me, the idea that, healers and magical practitioners worked so dynamically. They didn't necessarily always have a set ritual for everything. They, a lot of times, would interview their patients or clients, and they would develop processes and remedies and rituals for that person for a specific time. And that is probably the third surprising thing for me. The idea that everything has a moment. To everything, there's a season, that sort of mentality. The idea that a ritual that you do for one person might not work for another person.
Yeah, right.
And so that goes back to that idea of cunning, being able to figure out a situation for an individual rather than just parroting ritual.
You know, I love for me, as I went through the book, I looked at something in particular, and it explained why grandma, despite how crippling her arthritis was an expert sewer. She sewed, and why she sewed things in grandpa's clothes. And there was a part in your book where you talked about heart protection. I think that, please correct me if I'm wrong, but you talk about this heart protection where you actually use certain colors like red, and then you cut. Grandma was doing that stuff all the time. I can't even tell you why. But now I read the book and I thought, oh, okay, so this is what she did. She sewed stuff in each of the girls' clothes, us girls, 3 girls. She would sew stuff, she put them inside, and she would say to us, it's so you can remember me. But now I know, no, that's not what she was doing, right? So let's talk about this particular protection or spell or whatever we want to call it. But grandma would take out that, she would just get that needle and that thread out, and she would cut something out of something she had. And boy, she made these patchwork quilts too, but they were different. And so what did grandma know? Probably got it from the Ozarks, but she knew something, and it became her ritual for us kids.
You know, it goes back to this idea of repurposing and simplicity. You know, like I said earlier, a lot of times with Ozark folk healers and magical practitioners, you won't even know they are practicing. And so many rituals for healing and magical purposes. Just to comment on that, you know, in the old days, everything was healing. And if you were healing, it doesn't matter whether you were healing a fever or somebody's luck or somebody's love, it was all considered healing.
Yeah.
So today I say healing and magical practices as though they're different, but they're really not. They're just all for the same sort of purpose. But so many of these rituals were paired alongside mundane things. So I've met granny women. I've met people that still do, they sew up patches and clothes and things like that. And there's an intention behind this. There's an intention behind the colors that they choose. Or sometimes I've encountered in one case where I got the heart protection charm. The woman I interviewed, she made these little hearts out of red fabric usually, and she sewed them in usually the breast pocket of a jacket that was under her heart as a protection, not just for illnesses, but also magical, what we would call magical protection, that sort of thing. And in a lot of cases, they become very customized. So people would take embroidery thread and embroider the initials of the person and their birth date. And so this is a sympathetic connection to identifying the individual, that sort of thing. But, it's even just in patches, patching up a person's clothing, maybe, if it's somebody that's kind of down on their luck, or maybe they, fall a lot, maybe they're clumsy, you might use a green fabric or a yellow fabric for good luck, for prosperity, that sort of thing, to kind of give them a little pick-me-up. If it's somebody that's, hard in love, maybe you sew in a little red patch or something in their clothes. Likewise, if it's somebody you don't like, maybe you sew in a black patch on their clothes as a sort of keep away from me sort of thing. And so a lot of these rituals are are sort of hidden behind day-to-day processes, which makes it really hard to collect unless you are physically working with the person and they can explain this stuff. Because from the outside, if you walk in and you're looking for healing practices and you see somebody sweeping out their house, you may not take any notice of it. But underneath that, you don't know the prayers and verbal charms that they're saying, or just the act of, in the Ozarks, if you're cleansing out your house, you always sweep from the front door to the back door. And then you sweep all the dust out your back door as a sort of way of getting rid of all of this stuff. And so, but from the outside, if you didn't really sit down and talk with the people, you wouldn't really know that any of this was going on. It would be hidden behind all of these processes.
And, it's interesting because, I was reading your book and I was thinking to myself, especially with my sister and the bee thing, the wasp thing. And I just had a flashback. I know what grandma mixed together. It was snuff or tobacco, right? And how did I remember that? Okay, I remembered that because she did that. And then we got a hold of the snuff, and us three girls and the Giles boys went down to the railroad track and we were doing like the snuff, right? And somebody saw us and we all got called out in Sunday service by the pastor. Ooh. And I remember this. I just remembered this now. I mean, you have to understand what kind of church this was. It was the only church in town. It was people of all colors, all didn't matter. We all went to the same place. It was real gospel revival. And, like if you cheated on your wife, you had to go up front and he performed like a ritual. And the rituals, a lot of times that they performed were deeply seated in what you and I are talking about today. But I remember this because myself, my sister, Doris, Joyce, and me, and the Giles boys got called up in front of the church. Scariest time of my life. And he was just nuts. And my grandma stood up. And I don't know exactly what she said, but somehow it had to do with curing the bee thing. So we got out of that. But you see, my point is this. This was not unusual. This was the way people live, Brandon. And I think that's what we're talking about today. In our society, we treat this as different. But my grandma, my grandpa, the Giles boys, their parents, it didn't matter. People from this very small town, they just lived like this, right? I mean, that's what I take away from both of these books that I have and the way you're writing about it. This is just a way of life, right?
It is. It's a living tradition, and it's intimately connected to this sort of worldview that, I think in collecting a lot of remedies and things like that from older folks, older generations around here, there's this sort of connection to the good old days. And, we have to kind of realize that, first of all, the good old days weren't always good for everyone. And especially in the Ozarks and in the South.
Oh.
And we have an opportunity today to really build upon our cultural heritage while still making amends with, the people that we have wronged, and also being able to envision a future where these practices have evolved and people don't feel so weird about this being a culture that they can identify with. And so, one of the things that I, with the books and everything, I went back and forth about whether I wanted to publish a lot of this stuff. And my reasoning behind publishing it was this culture, for the most part, has gone into a sort of lull. I won't say it's completely dead, but there are so many people today that live in the Ozarks that have Ozark ties that don't know any of this stuff was around ever at all. And so my goal with publishing this stuff is really to revitalize the culture, to bring this back to the forefront. And in that process, like you said, the idea of separating out people because of their practices and things like that, I want this to be, a part of people's lives, but something that people can be proud of, something that people can honor. I know for me, growing up, talking to relatives and stuff like that wasn't always so fun. But I'm to the point now where I regret not having the opportunity to talk to them. I mean, imagine what I could have gained from that experience. So I always encourage people to talk to their family, first of all, collect stories, collect everything, even if it's mundane. Because like I said, especially in the Ozarks, but this is kind of cross-culturally, practices in folk magic and folk healing are often hidden behind normal day-to-day things. So it kind of takes talking to people sometimes in order to get this stuff. And so that's really where I am today, bringing this stuff out of the stereotypical sort of hillbilly image, bringing it to a place where we can actually analyze traditions, analyze things that we want to bring with us into the future and things that we want to leave behind as a part of the folk record.
Yeah.
And that's okay to do. I mentioned this in the book. There are plants that have traditionally been used in the Ozarks for healing purposes that I do not recommend anymore because there has been research done, scientific research done, and they are harmful. They're poisonous if you don't know what you're doing with it.
Exactly. And that's the key point. I certainly would never try to recreate what I saw grandma and grandpa do because I just don't know. But I do remember that they knew the difference, right? And they never thought really to share it or publicize it. This was really a survival mode for them in so many ways. I wanted to ask you, I know we've got a few minutes left, but this was a big part of our culture growing up as kids. And it was dreaming. Mm-hmm. Now, they didn't always say dreaming, but we would talk a lot about dreams. We would talk, and I mean this level of consciousness and what the messages were. And my grandma would talk about things that came forth and spirits that came forth. Isn't that also a very large part of the culture as well? Talking story from, what did she call them? Visions. She would call them visions, not dreams, right? But isn't this part of the culture?
Absolutely. Ozark culture, we are storytelling people. And, it's interesting to look at how sort of fantasy and reality blend a lot of times. And of course, especially old timers, they may be telling a story that seems very far-fetched, seems very fantastical, but they're completely serious about their experience. And so there's this line that's sometimes blurred between fiction and nonfiction in our storytelling. The idea that experiences with the other world can sometimes be very mundane. There's, as a part of sort of a foundational belief in the Ozarks, there's this idea that the other world is constantly present on top of and mirroring our own world. And because of that, it means that you can be walking through the forest and all of a sudden be in the other world and you don't even know it. Mm-hmm. And I think the Ozarks is one of these unique areas where that is still a part of not only our storytelling culture, but sort of our day-to-day culture, especially in rural areas. Certain times of the year, you still have old timers in 2022 saying, be careful because the veil is thin tonight, that sort of thing. Yeah. And sincerely mean it. This idea that times of the year, the veil can be thin and you can wander into the other world and not come back. You can be taken away by spirits or the little people who are the fairies, Ozark fairies. And so I think
we didn't even talk about that story.
That's a whole other.
That's a whole show. We could do a whole show on that. That's some good stuff, right?
Yeah. But traditionally, Ozark healers, magical practitioners, a huge source of inspiration and power has come from the other world. In the old days, healers often had to mask their traditions behind piety. So sometimes they would say that angels visited them and gave them remedies and things like that. These days, amongst neo-traditionalist practitioners, it's even older folks who are neo-traditionalist practitioners. It's this, there's a comfortableness with saying spirits, land spirits, little people, things like that.
Yeah.
But I still encounter today, praying grannies who have angels that come and sit beside them and tell them the words to pray over a person and things like that. So the line between visions and dreams is sometimes just as blurred as the line between the mortal world and the other world in the Ozarks. Yeah. It's sort of all blends together. And I actually get this question a lot because I talk about dreams, and people always ask, do you mean a dream or do you mean trance? And my answer is always yes. Because
Exactly.
in the Ozarks, from an Ozark standpoint, a vision you have while you're in and out of sleep in a field on a summer day is just as deep and developed as a dream you have while you're asleep.
Yeah.
You know, I have members of my own family who have the sight, the second sight. And so occasionally they'll be just sitting there and just have a vision of something.
Exactly.
And these are all referred to as dream, as vision.
Yeah. I got to tell you, the hardest thing for my dad, who New Yorker, true and true, married my stepmom, of course, not a New Yorker. It was so hard to see my sisters really struggle being taken from this beautiful place and put in New York City. I mean, it was really difficult for them. But one of the most important things I remember from all of this is my dad's frustration with how my mom and my grandma talked to all of us about honoring the vision. To this day, you know, she taught us the practice of visioning in the day and seeing your future. And my dad, Catholic through and through, my stepmom finally just told him, honey, you just need to shut up. That was yeah, you want to be living with me, you just need to stop it and let the girls develop the way they do. And that's really what, you know, I hear you bringing forth, is you're giving people a connection that probably they can't logically pinpoint, but as I'm reading the book, intuitively you're right there. And I think that's beautiful. I want to ask you this, please give out your website, and then what's your personal message, Brandon? What do you want to leave us with today? Thank you so much for all of this.
And thank you for having me. It's been great. My website is ozarkhealing.com. I have classes posted there. It's also a good way to get in contact with me if you have any questions or want to learn more. And really, you know, the message I have to people is, you know, we often get stuck in the big T, the capital T traditions. And we forget about how important it is for us to work dynamically, not just as healers and magical practitioners, but just as humans existing in this world. You know, there's been this image about the Ozarkers as being lazy. And it's not that we're lazy. We just understand the importance of sitting and being quiet and being present in the moment.
Yeah.
So that's the message I have. Be present in the moment. Be present with your traditions that change, and be present with family and friends who, you know, you can collect stories from, collect remedies from, all of this other stuff. Be present with them before it's too late.
That is one of the greatest gifts Grandma Glover gave all of us girls, what you just described. And that, to this day, I still practice her ritual around this. But to this day, it's one of the greatest gifts she's ever instilled upon us. And it was one of the hardest things for me, born in the Bronx, in the Deep South, learning this in a circle with Grandma. And to this day, it is more powerful than anything else I do. Brandon, thank you so much for everything. I hope you come back when you got your next book going on, okay?
Absolutely.
All right. Let's take a short break, everybody. We'll be right back.